please welcome the Honourable Craig Murray. Excellency, welcome back to the show, and welcome back to Twitter. And there's a tale attached to you and Twitter, isn't there? Tell us.
Yeah, I lost my Twitter account about 6 weeks ago when it was hacked. And it was hacked in an extraordinarily suspicious manner because not only was my password changed, which is how I first knew there was a hack, they managed to also change the name of the account while still keeping the blue tick. And they changed the email address and the telephone, so I couldn't get it back. And you're not meant to be able to make all of those changes at once. Twitter will block, if you change your password, Twitter will block you from making other changes for a period of time. So this must have been done as an inside job or by someone with a back door. But also, of course, this happened while my telephone was in the possession of Police Scotland or whichever security services they had passed it on to. And shortly after, a few days after, they'd seized my laptop also and made an electronic copy of it, which also would have given them access into my Twitter account. So, there's every reason to believe that this was the security services who were behind the hacking of my Twitter account, as opposed to just some random hacker.
There's probably the sound of jaws dropping all over the world at what you've just said, especially in the context that you are a former British ambassador. You are a man that has never been any kind of violent threat to anyone. You're an intellectual gentleman of the first rank. What possibly could be the justification for the police doing this, taking this action, and someone consequently becoming involved in that kind of skullduggery, and for what purpose?
It is extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, I am under investigation for terrorism. I'm under investigation under the Terrorism Act. We've had a letter telling us that. My lawyers have written to the police asking precisely what act of terrorism I am under investigation for, and have so far we've received no reply whatsoever. I was questioned by the police at the airport, at Glasgow Airport, for an hour, and they asked me equally, really, sort of, it was divided 50-50 between my support for WikiLeaks and my support for Palestine. And I gather, I would imagine the timing of this is dictated by trying to get me off social media and off the streets and away from demonstrations of things to prevent me campaigning for Palestine during the current genocide. I assume that's what has dictated the timing, but we're not sure because they just refuse to tell us what is this terrorism of which I'm accused. And that, as you say, I've never had any association with any violence of any kind. So, the idea that a former British ambassador is now under investigation for terrorism is really something. It's hard to believe, but that's the topsy-turvy world we've moved into. I think the sheer progress that's been made in the direction of fascism and in the cancellation of liberty and freedom of speech, particularly for people who support Palestine, is stupefying. I mean, it really is very difficult to believe this is where we are.
Yes, it is quite bewildering, the pace and the scale of the shredding of those characteristics, hallmarks, that were always held up, at least, as the distinguishing characteristics of the free world. Speaking personally, I know that both of my grandfathers went off to war, one of whom didn't need to. He was Irish and came and volunteered. They went off to war to fight for and potentially die for the preservation of a set of characteristics which they believed at least were characteristics of Britain, but which are now being literally shredded in front of our eyes, aren't they?
They are. And, we've seen people arrested for displaying Palestinian flags, for quite mild expressions of outrage, really, at the terrible destruction of women and children that's happening in Palestine as we speak. And we've seen, legal restrictions on freedom of speech and freedom of assembly multiplying and multiplying. A lot of this was started, which shouldn't be forgotten, by Tony Blair and New Labour, who brought in restrictions on speech and restrictions on assembly. We now have a new Tory Public Order Act under which any demonstration can be banned if it inconveniences or offends anyone. And frankly, every demonstration inconveniences or offends someone. There's no point in doing it if it doesn't. I would say. And there are also other measures, like this week, with very little publicity, we saw legislation which allows the government to snoop into the bank accounts of half of the population. They can snoop into the bank accounts of anybody in receipt of any kind of public funds, including child benefit and old age pensions. So, all of the views that we had of what constitutes the private realm, the realm of freedom of speech, the realm of freedom of thought, the realm of academic freedom, the realm of your finances being your own and not controlled and observable by the state. All of those presumptions of how society works are shifting in favor of this extraordinary power of central control.
Now, when I and Chris Williamson founded No to NATO, you were good enough to speak at our launch, despite having a different point of view to us about the Russian involvement in Ukraine. You nonetheless accepted to speak, and in a brilliant speech, you talked devastatingly about NATO. Daniel Hannan of the Daily Telegraph has just this evening predicted a catastrophic victory for the Russian armed forces, and has described the European Union as trembling in the wake of it. Is he right to be so devastated, Mr. Hannan? And what do you think the consequences for the NATO countries might be?
Well, the sad thing, of course, is that the war is going to end, as I said in that speech and as others have said, the war is going to end with a settlement that will be very, very close to what could have been achieved before anybody died. And there's no doubt that the war is going to end with Crimea being effectively ceded to Russia, whether formally or not, or how long it will take for that to become formal, I don't know. And it looks like it's going to end with Russian occupation of the Donbass region. And that was probably something Ukraine could have avoided if they'd been much more reasonable in negotiations at the start of the conflict. So, I think, there's no doubt. There was a rather amusing speech by Zelensky a few days ago, in which he said this counter-offensive had been a success because it hadn't lost too much ground. Well, an offensive in which you go backwards is not actually a great success. I think, and one of the sad things is that we've seen a decline of neutralism. The idea of Finland and Sweden joining NATO has achieved nothing. It's done nothing whatsoever to help the Ukraine. It's done no good to Finland or to Sweden. Sweden had not yet, membership not yet being achieved, but they're heading that way. And the more expansionist NATO becomes, the more dangerous to the world. There is no possibility that Russia will wage war on Western Europe. That's a mad fantasy, which just isn't going to happen. And there's no need to build the world's most massively armed defensive alliance against that eventuality. But now, of course, we see yet another example of what NATO is really about, which is the projection of neo-imperialism. And that's why you have massive NATO assets being deployed all over the Eastern Mediterranean as we speak, massive naval assets there, in order to threaten the poor Palestinians, who, of course, have neither army nor air force nor navy. So NATO is a terrible futility, an aggressive organization which feeds Russian fears, which makes conflict much, much more likely, not less likely, and which, of course, gives massive transfer of money from you and me and everybody listening to the military-industrial complex and to the politicians who get paid lots of money by the arms industry. So that's what NATO is.
Now, you were a diplomat of distinction. What did you make of the Security Council meeting this weekend, which ended in another, but perhaps the most expensive so far, US veto in defense of Netanyahu?
Yeah, I think the anger being felt at the United States is of an order which is game-changing. It's normally quite difficult for developing countries to stand up to the United States because they are dependent on trade access and dependent on aid payments. The whole international financial system is designed to make them dependent on the United States. And so they show their anger at the United States with reluctance. But I think that anger is now extremely real. It's quite interesting. I'm in Geneva rather than New York, at the other hub of the United Nations, but the one concerned with human rights and refugees, and where the UN work in Palestine is run out of. And I was listening to a debate on genocide here, which was organized for the 75th anniversary of the Genocide Convention. It wasn't meant to be about Palestine, but of course it was about Palestine. And interesting, every nation, for every delegate who spoke from, and these were diplomats, they weren't NGOs, every delegate who spoke from a developing country or from the Arab world mentioned Israel in terms of colonial occupation. They all framed it that way. And that's rather new. That wasn't normally how Israel was discussed at the United Nations before. So I think we're seeing a real change that will damage Israel and damage the United States in the long term in quite serious ways.
And what did you make of the British abstention? In a way, even more contemptible, no? One would have had perhaps more respect, if I can use that word in the context, if they'd stood up by the others in the Axis. The United States, Israel, and the UK has become an axis. But we abstained. Why?
That was truly pathetic. That was an attempt to cling to some of the relationships that the United Kingdom has internationally. It was an attempt not to incur quite as much opprobrium as the United States. Of course, it won't work. I mean, we were seen as just as complicit. If a genocide is happening and you won't even vote to stop it, what does that say about you? And the United States voted in favor of genocide, whereas the United Kingdom apparently couldn't work out whether it thinks genocide is a bad thing or not. It really is pathetic. And I I saw the UK ambassador sitting there. I don't know her personally, but I thought she looked deeply ashamed. I'm happy to say that I hope her conscience is troubling her, and I think everybody should send her pictures of dead children all the time, so she realizes you can't hang on to your career and your salary and do things which are totally and utterly immoral. And that woman is a disgrace.